Hello again everyone, welcome back to another episode of reviewing games from Grandmasters, where we review games based on the openings that we talked on the previous video. Now I do think that this video will benefit those who have actually seen the introduction video, which is technically the last episode of this playlist. There will be a link somewhere in the top of the video, so be sure to check that out. Or else you can just go to the playlist and go check it out yourself. But it's just going to be a video where we talk about pawn to c5 in depth and what black should avoid or go for in this position. But very quickly, I want to introduce you guys to a game that is played in Isle of Man between Adiban Baskaran and also Wojciech Radoslaw that leads to equality for black and white. And after rook to b1, we do see a very common line after pawn to b6, with Adiban tweaking a little bit with knight to b5, but all these should be the same in that there's no breakthrough for black and white. And as we proceed, we will see both players quickly trade off all pieces, and they very quickly agreed to a simple and quick draw. But the point of this game is to really tell you guys that there are really games played by Grandmasters that end up in a very theoretical draw if both players doesn't really want to play. Sometimes players just really do need that draw to end the day, and they just don't really want to complicate matters. Because some of the tournaments, such as this one in FIDE Grand Swiss, the more points you garner throughout the end of the tournaments, the more likely they're going to be a wildcard in the candidates tournament. If you win it, of course, you'll be guaranteed a spot in the candidates tournament. And so most of the time, you'll see players not willing to take such risks to actually, lose games and such, and play out lines that will guarantee at least a draw. But that is kind of one case in a scenario. What if white is trying to win the game, but black is trying to draw the game? As we'll see in the next game between Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and Viswanathan Anand, in the recently concluded Croatia Grand Chess Tour, you will understand that Maxime Vachier-Lagrave really need to win this event to actually qualify for the London Chess Tour final. And to hit that top 4 standings, Maxime really needs to win every games that he play, including this one. But Anand is kind of different. Anand is a wildcard in this event. He really doesn't need to win this event to qualify for anything. And so you'll see kind of different mentality for both sides. But this is not to say that Anand wants to draw this game quite quickly and comfortably, but rather because this is a rapid game, and so really both sides just went for it with the line that we talked about in the introduction video, with the move pawn to c5. And very quickly you will see that they follow the line that we talked about as well, with the queen being traded off early into the game, and after pawn to b6, Maxime actually deviated first and played pawn to h4. By doing this, you'll understand that white is actually looking for a win, because it forces the line to change with pawn to h5. If you play anything else, let's say, knight to e7 for example, then you'll see pawn to g4 trapping the bishop. The bishop moves anywhere to g6, it'll be pawn to h5. This would be losing for black. And so Anand has to play pawn to h5, but this actually just changes the evaluation of the game. But all that said, the principle is still similar, is to get this rook onto the 6th rank, or onto the 8th rank. Anywhere is fine as long as it's a defensive position. And here Maxime just traded off the knight for the bishop and go for pawn to c4. Now again, as we've talked about as well in the introduction video, that positional understanding still has to be applied. You can't just blindly take pawn on c4. And after bishop to c4, you'll just see that the pawn will actually storm to e6 with the rook supporting it. The rook comes to d2 and stuff. And so really, when you play a move, you want to play with reason. You want to have a solid reason why you play a certain move. And with pawn to d4, Anand's just saying, okay mate, you can just storm all you want with your pawns, but I'm just going to keep my position close as my king now is on the center of the board, and I will not let you have access to my king side as easy as you want. Really, in the last video, we also talked about bishop to b5 check, and after king to f8, plays pawn to c4. This will be slightly different, because then the king will be on f8, the knight will be coming to h6 to actually just protect this. In fact, here we can just play rook to h6, and after pawn to e6, we can already play rook to e8, where e takes f7, it's not a check, but the position where the king was on e8, it was a check, the rook cannot come to e8, and so that's why Anand just plays pawn to d4 in this position, to actually close down the center of the board, to not let Maxime have a grand access towards his king side. The game continued with rook to d1, targeting the d4 pawn, but after rook to d8 trying to protect it, Maxime then could have continued with rook to d2, but this will have guaranteed a very quick trade-off of the pieces where there is not much chances of winning. Instead, Maxime tries pawn to c5. The idea is after the pawn takes, we'll actually just get in with rook to b7. To sacrifice a pawn to get your rook on the 7th rank is actually very strong and increases your winning chances by a bit. Furthermore, next move will be bishop to c4, where it'll actually just restrict some of the movement from black. And so really nice initiative for someone who is looking for a win right here. But even with this, black is just very solid. Anand continues at knight to e7, and after rook to a7, knight to g6, getting a piece out. Targeting h4, also just protecting against pawn to f4. Anytime the pawn comes to f4, we can just take it. But after bishop to b5, king to f8, pawn to f4, Anand did not actually take it. he plays rook to h6. And again, I think of this as a very strange move because after bishop to c4, there's really nothing that can protect the pawn on f7 except moving the knight back to e7. And this is really not what you wanted. Moving your knight to g6 and then quickly back to e7. I guess in this position, Anand saw knight to f4 has something to do with rook to f1. Well, it's really not clear in this position. If you play knight to f6, there's rook to f7. I mean, there's really target on f7 right now. And really, it will be difficult for Anand to play. Borderline losing, perhaps. I mean, it's very common in this particular position with the idea of pawn to d3, sacrificing a piece, so you can get pawn to d2. I mean, the best that white can do is bishop to e2, but after queening in this position, you can see that this position is quite equal, with king being check, has to move, and then you can play pawn to g6. Should be equal, this kind of position. Anand did not see all that though, perhaps due to the fact that it's actually a rapid game. And after bishop to c4 to bring this knight to e7. But after rook to b1, we can really see that this pass pawn is really not passed anymore. It's really blocked by the bishop. Whereas if the knight was on f4, we can at least support this pawn advancing. And the rook on b1 is just trying to get it onto the 7th rank and try to just kill black in this kind of position. And after pawn to d3, trying to deflect the bishop so he can play knight to c6. But it's rather a useless effort as the rook can just move to a3. The c5 pawn and f5 pawn is currently weak, and at some point it's just going to be picked up by one of these pieces. And very quickly, as you can see, Maxim Vachier-Lagrave took c5 pawn. And even with this kind of position where black traded off most of his pieces and left with one rook only, the king is so advanced that there's no way to stop this pass pawn, yes, I mean the a pawn, from actually running down the board and promoting. And so in this position, Anand resigned. But it really goes to show in this position that no matter what white plays in this position, there will always be a counterplay for black to actually just reach equality. And as long as we remember the principle of the opening, we can actually just take on f4 without being afraid of, some kind of counterplay from white. And who knows, we might really win the game as well as black if white tries to win and overpush. But really, if you're not too familiar with the idea, please go and watch the introduction video. Also practice out a position on your own so they can quickly get used to it if one day you will decide to use this kind of position to reach a very quick equality as black. Now over the last few years, Maxim Vachier-Lagrave is not the only guy who actually tries to win the game with white in this position. In fact, in the very next game that I'm going to show you, Karjakin Sergey, or people who like to call the Minister of Defense, plays a lot of this line with knight to b5. And as promised in the introduction video, we're just going to talk about this as well, where white is really trying to complicate matter. The very plan is to bring the knight to c7, forking the king and the rook, but then also protects the knight here on c3. And so if we just take in the knight here on c3, he can just take back on c3, and quite honestly, perhaps this position is quite better for white. He has all these pieces out, rook to b1 is ready to be played. And so most of the time you'll see players playing the black side hold the horses with bishop to a5, trying to hold the fort here on c7, but also trying to avoid the potential skewer that could happen here after the rook is brought to b1. This game is played by Sergey Karjakin as white, and also Daniel Friedman from Germany as black. Daniel Friedman is a grandmaster from Germany that perhaps not everyone will actually know about. And the only time you can see him get into action is perhaps in the World Cup, and also some grand and big events in Germany, such as Dortmund and Granke, for example. Sorry if I actually just butchered the pronunciation of the city or the event. I tried to do my research and seems like Granke is the best pronunciation. But anyway, in this position, Karjakin actually just plays rook to b1, and since the a and b file is actually controlled by white, we can see queen takes c2. And so white really in this position is sacrificing b2 and c2 pawn for the activity along the b file and c file right here. In the future, he wants to bring the rook on the c file as well and try to infiltrate this way. And really black's duty is to prevent all that kind of plan from happening. And if black is lucky, if we can just get another pawn, for example, or if we can just exchange off enough materials such that white pieces is not active while trying to activate our pieces on our own, we can actually just win this game. So this is actually still very dangerous for white. But if played correctly, of course, white's the one who is just going to be pressing in this position. But nevertheless, black still has enough counterplay for him to actually win or defend his kind of position. But let's continue with the game. Karjakin actually continues with rook to b3, getting the rook out of the line of the queen, protecting the knight, preparing to just infiltrate on a b file if necessary, all between main line. And Daniel Friedman just continues with knight to e7. We have to activate our pieces, right? And after knight to e7, king f8, knight to b7, attacking the bishop on a5, the bishop just moves swiftly back to b6. Karjakin continues with a theoretical move with knight to d6, controlling the c4 square, the b5 square, e4 square. Now, due to many tactical reasons, I'm not going to discuss them one by one, but I'm just going to tell you that the knight on d6 actually deprived the square for the queen to escape and actually trying to trap the queen right here. Now, playing as black, you must always remember to bring our bishop to a5 to pin the knight from ever moving. In fact, if you pass the turn back to white, for example, we're playing pawn to h6 or pawn to h5, doesn't really matter. White will actually play bishop to d1 and our queen is officially trapped. We can play queen to d3, but then there will be knight to b5, opening up another line for the queen to be attacked here. And of course, either queen d4, queen c4, or queen e4 is all covered by the white knight and the queen right here and the knight right here on b5. And so that's why knight to d6 is a very important move to prepare an operations to trap the black queen. And so bishop to e5 becomes a very important move in this position. Now, I agree that, in this position, it comes down to the only move to actually survive or to actually draw this position or to actually win this position. And once you screw up, it's all over. But yeah, I mean, it's one move kind of defense and it's easy to remember. And once you remember, I think you can really use this to every player that you meet. And once you remember, I think you can use this kind of line against every strong player that you meet online or over the board. Or just to reach a drawish endgame where you can draw very quickly and comfortably so you can actually just rest and prepare for the next round. But then again, I do agree that this position might not be for everybody, especially for beginners starting out. So yeah, if there's any beginners watching, I'm just going to apologize beforehand because I agree that this video might be too heavy on the theory, but I promise there'll be easier one coming up, okay? So let's continue to our game, shall we? Again, the bishop is very important in pinning down the knight to the queen so the knight won't move, but also to just prevent the rook from infiltrating on b7, because of course we take the knight here on c3 and it's just going to be a free knight. And so Karjakin just plays bishop to f3. This is mainly to stop black from pushing to d4. Again, I mean, the threat is clear, right? To push the knight out of the way so you can just take the queen. And so bishop to f3 is just designed to stop that. Because of course, if pawn to d4, just bishop here to a8, this will be winning for white. Daniel plays bishop to d3, just being very annoying in this position. Again, black does not have any reason to play something like bishop to g6, where white is having all the control of the queen to e3, for example, trying to get into the queen side, getting rook onto c1. There's no need to do that. We play bishop to d3, annoy the heck out of white in this position. The rook here is stuck in a corner of the board, and so the only way to release it is actually to play queen to c1, which is what Karjakin played. And after the trade here, we can see that, okay, we can bring the rook to c file, but we traded off one of the major attacker here, which is the queen. So that's a great achievement for black, or for Daniel Friedman. But just as when Daniel Friedman is defending quite nicely in this position, and he could just bring the half a point back home, he plays a move that actually blunders the position. Quite technically subtle move that perhaps is just difficult to judge, but he plays knight to g6, leaving the bishop hanging here on d3, allowing knight to d5. Daniel must have thought it's okay because there's knight to e5, protecting the bishop here on d3. But what he definitely didn't think about is definitely the change of the structure of the position. And what do I mean by that? The knight here on c3 is suddenly on f4, what is more active towards the king side position. The c file is now open for the rook to come in. The b file is now open for the rook to come in as well. And so all of this would not happen if it were not for the knight d5 move here earlier into the position. Of course, if Daniel just moved his bishop back to g6, he would have maintained the structure here in the center of the board. The pawn here with control c4 and e4. The next plan perhaps might be knight to f5, trading off the active knight here on d6. But by allowing knight to d5 and knight to e5, the structure changes, such that the evaluation of course changes as well, and suddenly you have to calculate again because the diagonal is open, the bishop's kind of hanging, and so there's no need to go into such complications in the first place. Even though this position is perhaps defending for black, there's no need to change the structure for opponent to gain entry to your king side or to your position. But it is what it is. Karjakin sees the opportunity to bring the rook to b7, and after bishop to b6, which is the logical move to bring the bishop back, Karjakin goes rook to c8 check. And so just really following the principles, right? Bringing all the rook to the c file, b file, and just infiltrating on the queen side. And after the trade, as you can see, the king is so trapped in the corner of the board. The rook is not developing at all in this moment. And after bishop to d4, trying to desperately hold the b8 square, this is too late. Rook to a8. First one on the queen side as a decoy. And even after this position, when the king gets to the a pawn and takes the knight, this king is too far-fetched over the side of the board. This pawn is just going to be picked up next turn, and with it, it's the rest of this pawn, and all these passed pawns is just going to be passed for white, and it's just going to be winning. And so in this position, after rook to h7, Daniel Friedman resigned. And so during this kind of position, there is no need to go fancy. If white repeats like this, I mean, you can just repeat, and it's just an easy draw for you. And in case if white does not actually repeat, I mean, you can still get a very good position, being up 2 pawns and very annoying for white. And once you trade enough pieces, perhaps you'll just be winning as blank this position. Let's just play queen to e3. After queen to e3, pawn to e3, it is hard to say that being up 2 pawns and this crappy double pawn to center the board, black's just not better. It's just really hard to say that. And so we are at the end of the video. As you've probably noticed, this video is quite heavy and jam-packed with all this theory, but as I've mentioned before, once you memorize the lines, you understand all the principles around, I think it's going to be very simple for you to play this line and go into a draw. I mean, I put this kind of position in Stockfish and played it out myself, and not too bad. Disclaimer being it's Stockfish 7, so I think it's still a very good result. But I promise, I'll try to bring up some of the lines that are easier to play for Karjakin. And with that said, thank you for making it to the end of the video. If you like it, please press the like button and share it with your friends that might need it. Otherwise, thanks for watching. See you soon.